this last video, I thought it would be appropriate to go back to the beginning of the course and look at the Robert Fishman article, The American Metropolis at Century's End. Because I don't have enough time to examine all of the potential factors, and I wouldn't even be able to identify them all, that affect a city's growth, even one that I'm very familiar with. I thought it would be nice to go back and look at those top 10 things identified as key factors in the development of American cities. I'm going to try to make this last video without too many cuts, as I've already spent countless hours editing the others. At the end, I'll also reflect on what this process has taught me. So, to begin, first item in the Fishman article was the 1956 Interstate Highway Act and the dominance of the automobile. I already kind of covered that in the second video in talking about I-35, because that wouldn't be possible without the Interstate Highway Act, or at least not in the same fashion. So I won't go through that again. The second item is the Federal Housing Administration Mortgage, Finance, and Subdivision Regulation. I don't know enough about how that directly impacted Round Rock or the surrounding communities, just because I don't know about the financial mechanisms of the area particularly, but even if they didn't directly lead to the developments that we see today, I think those things definitely laid the platform for what was to become the American suburb. The third item is deindustrialization of central cities. I don't actually think this one applies too much to Round Rock, because Austin was never a big center of industry. Really the only area this might apply, to my knowledge, in Texas would be Houston, and I don't think Houston has been particularly deindustrialized. So that's an area that Texas as a whole may be somewhat exempt from. The fourth item is urban renewal, downtown redevelopment, and public housing projects. Again, this one is one that I can't speak to a great deal, as it is somewhat outside of my experience. I don't know much about public housing projects in Round Rock. Number 5 is Levittown, which I mentioned briefly in the third video, because I think that it definitely, Levittown and other early developments like that were essentially the prototypes that led us to where we are today as far as subdivisions and all of the modern developments we see. Number 6 is racial segregation and job discrimination in cities and suburbs. This one I also feel I can't speak to, as it's beyond my experience. I do know that racial issues did play a part in the development of Round Rock, just like any city, and certainly cities in the South, or as I like to think of Texas, South adjacent. I do know that there were certainly separate schools and facilities, but the closest connection I have to them is a number of years ago they preserved one of the old African-American only school houses that was left in Round Rock, and turned it into a multi-use building on one of the high school campuses. But I don't know enough. I mean, I'm certain that they did play a role, but it's something that's not obvious to me in any meaningful way that I can comment strongly about. Although I realize I just said quite a bit, I don't feel there's much meaning behind it all. Enclosed shopping malls is number 7. And I can definitely see this one, because it's hard to do much of anything in Texas summer when it can get up to 110 or even higher at times. But it's hard for me to see exactly how they led to the developments in Round Rock, because there is a mall in Round Rock, but it's very much on the border between Austin and Round Rock. So I could see it as maybe forming, as we talked about at that nexus point where you have enough, there are enough people who can access a mall or a facility like that to make it profitable. Number 8 is Sunbelt style sprawl. I think I already covered that and definitely covered it in the previous video. Air conditioning, I mentioned that as well. It's number 9. Texas summers are indeed brutal. And air conditioning has certainly increased the number of people who are willing to and wanting to live in Texas. And number 10 is or the last item is the urban riots of the 1960s. And having not experienced those, I don't know, it's hard, it's difficult for me to make a comparison to what they have changed and what they led to. Obviously, I know the impact of the civil rights movements and things like that on society, but it's hard for me to see it in a physical context. And again, I think this relates back to the segregation issue. It's just something outside of my experience and therefore difficult to comment on. I won't go through the top 10 most likely influences for the next 50 years for the sake of time, but I will say that I'm fascinated to see what will happen, and I think it's going to be very difficult to predict. I think there are factors that few people are even considering right now. I'm currently reading the book The Physics of the Future by Michio Kaku, and if any of those predictions as to what technology will be like in the coming decades, I think cities and the way society even functions will be changing at an unprecedented rate. So I'm fascinated to see what happens. So I just watched the video back while editing it for this last segment, and I think something that caught me that I didn't realize as I was actually saying it was how often I was saying, I don't know, I can't relate. And I think that kind of captures the idea that cities, being constructs of human interaction and society, are incredibly complex things, and to understand them requires interests and, well, not interest, knowledge and understanding of incredibly diverse fields. Because without a more complete understanding of why things are the way they are, which we can't achieve without understanding how they became that way, it's more difficult to make appropriate choices. In looking back at this project, I found it interesting. It was fun to do. At times, I certainly wish I'd just written a paper, because I realized I had put so many hours into just editing footage, while in a fraction of the time someone sitting next to me in a computer lab had written out their entire essay. But it was certainly advantageous. I learned a lot about myself. I have hours of footage of me thinking. I didn't realize that when I think, especially if I'm alone, I kind of just glaze over and look into space. It was also a nice project because I was working almost entirely from home, because that's where my equipment is, which means I've got on pajama pants. It's a very comfortable way to work. So I did have a good time, and I hope you enjoyed it. I feel I should leave you with one final interesting fact about Round Rock. A number of movies have been shot in Round Rock, none that are particularly good, although I suppose The Rookie wasn't too bad. But one that a lot of people don't know about is the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was filmed in an area that is now a multi-use park, I suppose you'd call it. It's got apartments and stores and office space, but it is multi-use, so it's thinking in the right direction, I suppose, but it's almost entirely concrete there, so there are very few trees, so it's not a particularly green multi-use facility. But it was, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre was filmed out there at this old derelict house, that was moved a number of years ago and restored, which I think kind of defeats the purpose of being a derelict house. But there, that's the last random fact I can think of about Round Rock that I can find some support for on Wikipedia, which is not research. Anyway, again I say, I hope you enjoyed this to some degree, and thank you for watching.